Hello everyone, today we're going to be going over the June 2025 Life Science Biology Regents exam. In this video, we're going to be focusing on the fifth cluster of questions, which covers questions 22 through 27. We're going to go ahead and start off with number 22, which is based on this diagram and blurb, which is titled Salt Marsh Shoreline. It says that salt marshes are unique ecosystems located along an ocean shoreline between the ocean itself and dry upland ecosystems. They are important areas that filter water, protect coastlines, and provide essential habitat. Salt marshes can be affected by tides and weather events. Depending on a variety of factors, salt marshes can contain varied amounts of vegetation, which can influence the biodiversity and function of the salt marsh. The model below shows some information about a typical salt marsh. So this is the anatomy or the makeup of a marsh. We can see here that it is organized in levels of increasing height. So at the lowest level, it's subtidal. So everything here is submerged. It's below the tide. Remember that the tide is just the level of water. So if you're high tide, you have a high level of water. Low tide, you have a low level of water. Sub means below. So subtidal is below the tide. And then we have the tidal mudflat. So when the tide increases, when the water level increases at night or in the morning, this all becomes submerged with water. Then we have the low marsh, which is flooded at high tide. So again, this becomes submerged underwater at high tide. Here we have the high marsh with salt panes. So this is reached by salt water or spray at very high tide. So this level isn't always submerged. It's only submerged when you have extremely high levels of water or when the waves crash over this line here. And then we have the upper border, which is reached only by the storm surge. So when a high amount of rainfall impacts an area, the water level will obviously increase because you're pouring water into a space, and this will become flooded. This will become again flooded entirely, right? Only there, and this is upland, which is above the tidal zone. So usually this land does not get flooded whatsoever, but everything else does. Okay, and we can see here how each one of these levels is its own has its own unique population of animals, and it all maintains this beautiful and diverse ecosystem. So number 22 asks us which claim can best describe the complex interactions that would have the greatest immediate effect on populations of smooth cordgrass in the low salt marsh. So if we look at the low salt marsh over here, we have the smooth cordgrass. It's a animal, or rather, it's a plant that impacts that area. So it exists in the low marsh, and we can see here how cordgrass also inhabits the high marsh. So we have these two levels that is inhabited by the cordgrass. Okay. So number 1 says the smooth cordgrass population would most likely be affected by an influx of salt marsh sparrows that relocate after severe storms. Now, for a population to be impacted, it can either increase or it can decrease. There has to be a clear connection to that. Just because there's more birds that are moving into this area doesn't mean that will have an effect on the cordgrass. Remember that the cordgrass population in the low salt marsh specifically, we don't know if those birds are going to eat the cordgrass. We don't know if they're going to fertilize the cordgrass, so we don't know the immediate impact on their population, right? If they said that the sparrows were a consumer of cordgrass, then we'd be able to be like, yeah, it would decrease their population, but because that information isn't stated, we can't conclude that will have an impact. Choice 2 says the smooth cordgrass population would be most affected by rising sea levels due to global warming that affects the tide level. This is also false because the low marsh is frequently flooded at high tide. So every single day when high tide comes, the water level on Earth just naturally changes because of the moon. It goes high tide and low tide. So this area will already be submerged with water on high tide. So it doesn't matter if the water level of the earth or global sea levels increase, because this environment is already used to being submerged with water. As a matter of fact, fish live inside of it. That's how frequently it is covered by water. 3, the smooth cordgrass would be most affected by a temporary increase in salinity due to severe storms. Again, if it's temporary, if it's a temporary increase, that means that it's not going to carry over in shaping the overall form of that population, right? Why? Because again, severe storms do end up reaching these environments, right? It's literally said over here, the upper border is reached by storm surge. So it's not uncommon that storm surges are impacting this environment, and as a result the environment still exists even though storm surges exist. So even though there would be a storm surge, that would more or less impact these upper levels rather than this level, just because it's already used to being submerged. And that leaves us with choice 4, right? The smooth cordgrass would most likely be affected by erosion due to severe storms and resulting floods, right? If you erode away this land, that means that it doesn't exist there anymore. Okay, erosion is a removal of land over time by water. So if this would be eroded, it would be flattened, and this low marsh would then turn into a tidal mudflat because erosion reduces height. So because it's now at a different height, obviously it will permanently be submerged underwater instead of only being submerged at the high tide, and also it loses its height, and it loses all of these curves that allow the fish to live throughout there, right? And again, an eroded environment is one that you can't get back, and that'll permanently change how this environment behaves and acts. So that's why that's the correct answer. Right, the question continues. It says that erosion can affect shorelines, including salt marshes. Mathematical models often report shoreline erosion by using transect distance. Transect distance measures the same sand dunes along the same line between two specific points. Due to the influence of tides on coastal zones, elevation also affects erosion. The models below show some information about factors that affect shorelines, okay? So offshore means it's off the shore, surprisingly, obviously. It's in the name. So here's our shore. This is our water level, and the point that it reaches the sand is the beach face, right? That's the shoreline. And then there's this flattened area called the berm, and then this is the vegetation line, okay? So if we look at this, this is all dirt and sand. It's a dune because it, kind of reaches a peak over here, and then it drops off into the berm and then the shore. So the shore over time will, continue to go up here and then back down, up here and back down. And as it moves back and forth, it'll carry the sand away from the berm, right? It'll transport more of the sand out. Because as the water is flowing in, it obviously will flow back into the water, and that action of it flowing back into the water carries sand with it. So it's carrying away sand from this corner over here, which will flatten it out over time. And it'll flatten it out further or deeper and deeper into this shoreline until this dune collapses, right? So the dune used to have this other space over here, but the water reached it and caused it to become unstable and collapse. Okay, it kind of sucked away all of the sand that used to be in this component, and now there is this angle, right? And at a certain point, this is no longer structurally stable, so the scarp, which is caused by this angle, right? All the sand here is missing because the water pushed it or pulled it back into the ocean. It collapses, right? Because the sand doesn't want to stick at a 90-degree angle, right? It's not natural for you to see 90-degree angles in nature. So the scarp collapses, and now you have a brand new dune, and then the plants continue to grow on this side of the dune as well, okay? So that's kind of a diagram of how this erosion happens, right? The water comes in, and it begins to steal the sand away, and it steals so much sand that you form a scarp, right? Half of the dune becomes missing because all of the sand got pulled into the water, and then this scarp then collapses and forms a new dune. But the issue is this new dune is further away from where the old dune used to be, and that's how we get this transit distance, right? The distance between this new and old dune, okay? And here we have the models of shoreline erosion. So this shows the change in elevation that occurs in these dunes, and we see the overall trends that there's a sharp decrease in the elevation, right? There's a decrease in the height of these dunes as the water level will continue to rise and erode more shoreline. So number 23 says, using the information provided, which statement best describes how natural shoreline erosion affects the habitat's carrying capacity? So carrying capacity is often tied to the amount of space available, and we understand that shoreline erosion, well, if you erode something, you're taking it away. So you're taking away from the area of the shoreline, which means that there's less space for animals to live on, right? These plants now have less space to live. and to grow because the water has invaded in their space. So we know that the carrying capacity, or the amount of animals that can live in that environment, should go down because there's less space for them to live in. So the habitat carrying capacity should decrease, not increase, which is why we're eliminating choice 2 and 4. If there's less space, you cannot support more animals. Okay? And let's look at this decrease, right? This decrease in this elevation is way more rapid without vegetation, right? This is an immediate decrease. This is an immediate decrease versus with this graph, when you do have vegetation, there's a plateau and then it begins to decrease. There's a plateau and then it begins to decrease. But here, there's an immediate drop off, which leads me to select choice number 3. Okay, habitat carrying capacity rapidly decreases in shorelines without vegetation, right? Without vegetation, the elevation rapidly decreases, the transient distance rapidly increases, right? So now there's, you're moving inwards at a greater distance. So now there's even less land for all of these plants to live on, and as a result, less can live on that land. So the carrying capacity will decrease, okay? So over here we have global climate change may impact salt marshes and other coastal ecosystems. The graph below shows some data collected by NASA using satellites. Okay, so here is the current rate. The shoreline, or the global level of water, the sea level, is increasing at 0.42 centimeters a year. Here is the sea level at 2023, and extrapolated means predicted. So we predict that this level, the sea level, will continue to increase over time. So 24 says, using evidence provided, evaluate the claim that rising sea levels will impact the number and types of organisms that interact within a low marsh. Okay, so if we're evaluating a claim, we're either saying, yes, it's true, I support it, or we're saying, no, it's false, I don't support it. Okay, so in other words, to evaluate a claim, you just need to say whether it's valid or not, right? If a claim is valid, well, that's a good, to evaluate something is to give it value, right? Does it have value? Is it good, or does it not have value? Is it bad? So the claim here is that rising sea levels will have an impact in the number or types of organisms that interact within a low marsh. And if we look at a low marsh over here, this is a low marsh. If sea levels continue to increase, this low marsh will turn into a tidal mudflat because the water will permanently be at this high level, okay? And as a result, if the water is at this high level constantly, well, how will these birds live here, right? These birds live on the solid land. If this is now all water, well, the population of heroes and ergets will then decrease. But the population of crabs, mussels, and worms will increase because now they have more area, right? This low marsh then became a tidal mudflat. So I'd say that the claim is valid, right? It makes sense that there will be a change in the animals, the types of animals that live in that environment when the sea level changes, because as the sea level rises, the type of environment 100% changes. So you can say that the claim is valid as sea levels increase. Crabs and mussels will move into the new low marsh area, which will provide more food for herons and egrets, increasing their population. Right, so essentially what's happening here as this flooding occurs, right, as this increase in water level occurs, these crabs, mussels, and worms that usually live in the tidal mudflat, which is flooded at high tide, right, the water is used to be, they're used to the water being here, right? If the water level continues to increase, this low marsh will kind of start to turn into a tidal mudflat. So these crabs, mussel, and worms that are usually used to being covered by the tide will then continue to find home in this new part of the low marsh, right? As the water level increases, the low marsh turns more and more into a mudflat. So now the crabs, mussels, and worms have more place or more space to live, and as they move into this low marsh area, these herons and egrets can then eat them. Or they lose space as the water level increases all the way here and the low marsh disappears, right? So their population could decrease because now they have less space. So that's kind of the main idea here. You could have also said that rising sea levels may cause the mudflat to move into the low marsh, which could decrease the habitat availability for minnows and silversides. This could decrease populations of herons and egrets because of a food shortage. Okay, so as long as you say that the claim is valid, because it is, and then you support it by saying some sort of way that this environment will change, you would have gotten full credit here. All right, so it says that strategies that mimic the natural surroundings are being developed to reduce erosion and restore shoreline ecosystems. The chart below shows some information about the characteristics of various options for shoreline restoration. So we have two types. We have living shorelines and harder techniques, right? We can have vegetation only, we can have sills, revment, and bulkheads. And they each have their advantages, their disadvantages, and their costs, right? So this is a big breakdown of what you can do. Number 25 says, which type of restoration project would promote the conditions necessary for the development of a stable ecosystem that would support complex interactions between the organisms living there? So if you want a stable ecosystem, you want high biodiversity. You want to have a wide and diverse range of animals living there. Okay, so which one of these projects or which one of these techniques will preserve the native species or will increase the amount of species living there? Well, obviously it's going to be the vegetation only. Why? Because instead of being made of steel, timber, concrete, or stone, rubble, or concrete, or stone, it's made with native plants. And if you have native plants, you're then increasing the number of species living there. You're permanently providing this native layer of plants that are native to the environment, which means that you have more producers or you have more plants that can provide energy or provide food for the consumers and herbivores. And essentially, you're increasing the carrying capacity of that environment by introducing more native creatures there. Okay. Introducing stone won't help increase the stability of the environment, because the stability of the environment directly depends on how many native species are there. And if you're increasing the native species, that's always good for supporting the health of that environment. That's a very key detail you need to remember here. So the correct answer here obviously has to be 3. Planting vegetation along the dammed or the damaged shorelines will provide shelter for the protection of shoreline organisms, right? Animals live in these plants, so providing more native plants will then allow for more habitats to form. Okay, bulkheads limit the biodiversity, right? Because they don't add any more plants to the damaged shoreline. This restores the loss of plants in that shoreline erosion, or that initial shoreline erosion. Okay, the other two choices don't really make sense here. Hard structures will decrease the carrying capacity of the environment because, well, it'll take up space, right? And it won't add new species, or it won't add existing species there, increasing the diversity, right? Or increasing the higher the population, more species that are living in your environment, the more stable it is, right? So just adding concrete won't do that. The same reason choice 1 is also wrong. Okay, if only one species of plant enters an environment, that's decreasing your biodiversity, which is decreasing your stability. Number 26 says, which claim best describes the complex interactions in a living shoreline that are affected by changing conditions, such as a severe storm? So erosion that occurs during a storm can cause damage to the slope of the land, which exposes high marsh plants to decreased levels of salt. This is false, because if you have a storm, right, you're increasing the water level. So if you're increasing the water level, you're increasing the exposure of these plants to levels of salt, right? If the water level is high, that means that there's more salty water that is, hitting you. So that won't decrease the levels of salt. If anything, that will increase the levels of salt because you're further submerged in this salty water. Okay, number 2 says oyster reefs can reduce erosion caused by storm waves, which allows salt marshes to expand upland, increasing habitat availability for other organisms. Well, oyster reefs are are part of these sills, right? Sills are made from oysters. They provide habitats and they slow upland water transfer. So if you're slowing the transfer of water upland, that means that you're preserving these low marshes and you're preserving these high marshes because water will seep less and less into these higher levels. So as a result, these levels don't get eroded as much because the water doesn't reach there. Wherever the water reaches, there will be erosion. So if the water doesn't reach here, a higher percentage of its area will be conserved, which means that there's more space for animals to live in, which will increase their populations, which is why that answer choice is correct, right? Choice 2 is going to be the one I'm going to go for here. Okay. 3, bulkheads prevent erosion and increase biodiversity. That's false, right? Bulkheads don't increase biodiversity because they don't add any extra species to the mix, right? They just add concrete. 4, severe storms have no impact on the salinity. That's false, right? Severe storms will increase the water level, right? Water has salt in it. So if you increase the level of water just by rain, which is what a storm does, you are indirectly increasing the salinity or the exposure to salinity or the water level of that environment. Okay, so the last question in this section says that water levels across the Great Lakes are primarily the result of natural uncontrolled water supplies into the basin. In June 2019, Lake Ontario experienced record high water levels resulting from heavy rains and storms. Oswego, New York, is a city located on the shoreline of Lake Ontario. Significant damages and other impacts were experienced across the system. Concerns about shoreline loss range from a loss of revenue from recreational activities in lakeside towns, such as boating, fishing, swimming, and fine drinking, to the loss of property for homeowners and businesses. Shoreline communities are seeking reliable ways to reduce property damage and maintain the beach town culture and natural recreational opportunities. The photograph shows one shoreline in Oswego, New York, after the 2019 high water event. So we can see here how the land here is like crumbling pretty much. The water level increased so much that they carried so much dirt back into the water that it caused all of this to collapse, right? There shouldn't be this harsh decrease. It should be a nice smooth slope, but the sheer amount of water caused all of it to fall off. And as a result, your shoreline has decreased, right? The shore used to be like this wide, but now all of that has collapsed and gone into the water. As a result, people have less land to work with. You decreased your shoreline. You know, if there was a restaurant here, that restaurant probably collapsed because it was using that land that now it no longer exists, right? And obviously that causes a big mess for people because the shoreline is a place where you can fish. It's a place where you can build a restaurant. It's a place where you can get a beautiful view of the water. So what 27 is asking us to do here is to identify the best possible option for a shoreline restoration in that town. And we want to base this restoration from the shoreline engineering solutions chart based on cost, reliability, and aesthetics. Evaluate the social and environment impacts of this solution using those criteria and their trade-offs. So given the problem here, given this loss of coastline, which one of these 4 choices should we go for here? And the correct answer is that you can go for any one of these as long as you manage to support it using the following, right? As long as you state the name of a solution from this chart specifically, as long as you discuss the cost, reliability, and aesthetics that this choice brings, and as long as you discuss the social and environmental impacts of it, you will get full credit. So it doesn't matter if you say, I want to do vegetation only, and someone else says bulkhead. They're both correct as long as they can support that by discussing the cost, reliability, aesthetics, and then the social and environmental impacts of that choice. Okay? So correct answer here was you could say that bulkheads should be placed along this damaged shore because they have a higher initial price but a lower maintenance cost and serve as permanent and reliable solutions to environmental concerns of shore loss. So what's that doing? Well, that's a discussion of cost and reliability, right? It's a permanent solution, and even though it has a high cost, it has a low maintenance cost. And you can say that they are set back from the water so social and recreational activities can continue without aesthetics being affected. So because we're implementing a wall here, right, you can continue to appreciate the shoreline because it's no longer being eroded. And just because it's a wall doesn't mean that the aesthetics are impacted. So that's just one example of an answer you could have written here. You could have also said that because the community is focused on the social and recreational value of the shoreline, the rev tent or revetiment would be the best aesthetic option to restore the shoreline because it looks natural. The revetiment is the most reliable option and is cheaper to maintain. However, it does not protect against flood and has the highest cost. Right? So here again, we're discussing the cost, reliability, and we're discussing how those impacts play a role in maintaining some sort of aspect of this community. Okay. Finally, you could have also said that the best solution for Oswego is to install sills because they are not too expensive to construct, have low maintenance, and look more natural than some other options. Sills do not prevent the flooding of businesses, but they do slow down the water rise while providing habitat for organisms and protecting wetlands. Okay, so again, I just gave you three options that supported three of these treatments to that solution. They all talked about effectiveness, they all talked about price, and they all talked about preserving some sort of social aspect, right? You could even go and say vegetation only is the best option. You could say that taking the vegetation only route is the best option for Oswego, even though it provides no high water protection. It largely it has a very low construction cost and an even lower maintenance cost while offering the best preservation of aesthetics due to its material of native plants, right? So that's another example of what you could have said, right? So as long as you follow those three guidelines, you would have gotten full credit for this question, and that's the end of this section. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments below.